social movements are really defining the public sphere the public sphere in our lives. There are many of them, and on a lot of issues. Many of these you don't even hear about, and you just go on your life as usual, and they usually go to dustbins of history pretty quickly. But every now and then, they succeed. And when they do, they leave indeletable marks on human history. So today what I want to do is I want to sensitize you to finer points of what we call social movements. Academically, it's a huge subject. There's a whole field called social movements in political science. But in this small tour, we won't seek definite answers. Rather, what I want you to do is I want to offer lenses to you through which you can capture some continuities or some forms of rebirth across these different social movements over time and over space. And I hope these things will become more apparent. In doing so, I will also intermittently touch upon the Gezi Parkı movement to provide an alternative perspective to what a lot of people call a watershed in recent Turkish political history. This was a couple of weeks of demonstrations that took place beginning at the very last day of May, pretty much until it lasted until the mid-June, if not later. So, what is a social movement? A social movement consists of a sustained challenge to power holders by means of public displays of that population's worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. As I told you, there are many social movements around the world, but be it from the protection of pandas in Southeast Asia to colored revolutions in Eastern Europe, many of them share common traits. I will focus on two. The first one is that social movements are of a contentious nature. And the reason behind that is quite simple. Why would a group of people risk their well-being, their financial resources, even their lives for a cause? Possibly because that they cannot necessarily voice their dissent or voice their grievances through regular political channels, like political parties, other political participatory mechanisms, elections, and the like. And what is more is that often these conventional political channels, at first, do not lend a sympathetic ear to these guys. And it is the very process of these social movements' drive to bring these issues to the center of political life that leads to contentious politics. Trying to protect the status quo, the state usually tries to demobilize, overcome, and sometimes even subjugate these movements. So therefore, and usually in doing so, they are not very reluctant to use police and other coercive measures to subjugate these movements. A second definition is that, a second common trait is that these movements are popular, by definition, at least some parts of the society. Social movements thrive on participation to secure their resource base and their manpower. But in the modern world, almost exclusively, this participation is on a voluntary basis. So how do you secure the support of a lot of people whom you don't promise immediate benefits? So to do that, the social movements are extremely adept and agile in creating resources. They are very good in marketing, adopting innovative marketing techniques, and they are not very hesitant to use top-notch technology to overcome and sometimes evade state repression, and most of the time, secure a strong human base for themselves. But what leads to the birth of social movements? Now, of course, these are extremely complex phenomena, so we cannot talk over all the reasons at once. But if we could categorize them a little bit, I can say that social movements are caused by slow happening and fast happening reasons, and their causes and their consequences are also fast materializing, and then there are those that materialize over a long period of time. Now, if you could let me indulge in a little bit of earth sciences here, I'll give you some examples from earth sciences. Now, think about a tornado. You can have instant flash tornadoes. If you have enough temperature differences and enough pressure differences, it pretty much all happens instantaneously, as we saw what happened in the Philippines the other week. And compare that tornado with an earthquake. An earthquake, like a tornado, is a very, very quick event. So its consequences, at least physically, is very quick. It takes over seconds, if not days, right? But it takes hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, for that pressure to build up on those fault lines. And once that fault line breaks, with this event, what we call earthquake, happens. Now, of course, you can also think about slow effects or slow consequences of events. For instance, meteorite hit the world very quickly, and the hypothesis is that it made the dinosaurs extinct. But that extinction took thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, through acid rains, through the death of tall trees that what the dinosaurs used to eat and whatnot. Likewise, global warming. I don't know if I may sarcastically say, thanks God, that the effects of global warming, the consequences of global warming are also happening over a long period of time, and we don't observe them instantaneously. We can observe the same logic to social movements. But there is one problem. When we think about social movements, because of our small span of attention and because the media needs so quick things to digest in their everyday broadcast, we tend to focus on what is now. So we tend to focus on immediate causes and immediate consequences of social events. That holds for social movements too. And this leads to what I call the myopia problem. Now, imagine that you're in a parallel world and you are having your cup of latte and looking over this beautiful snowy hill. And you have all the time in the world, right? You wish. If you observe that snowy hill enough, every other minute or every 5 minutes, you'll see small parts of snow trickling down the hill. If you watch the hill just a bit longer, maybe once half an hour, maybe once an hour, you'll see a snowball rolling down the hill. If you're adamant enough, if you have enough time, and if you're also unlucky enough, perhaps you'll see an avalanche once a year or maybe once every other year. But what's interesting is that what leads that snowball to roll down the hill and what leads that avalanche to fall are actually the same factors. But once in a blue moon, when that avalanche happens, so when a social movement breaks and it really becomes very popular around the world, we tend to focus on its immediate vicinity, what happened right before it and what happened right after it. But to establish the concept of rebirth across social movements, we should be aware that some of the causes of social movements take a long time, as well as the consequences of social movements can span over a long time to affect other social movements. So once we realize such possibilities for continuity across movements, then we can get into the concept of rebirth across social movements. So in what ways can rebirth happen? Well, the blue you see is a cell, and the green you see is a virus. So you can think about society as the cell and social movements as a virus. Mind you, not all viruses are necessarily bad. Vaccinations are also a source of viruses sometimes. And what happens is when a social movement happens, it injects its RNA or DNA into the cell. And what happens once a social movement dies? Sometimes this RNA genome or sequence leaves a trace in that cell. And that trace lies dormant for some time. Until the next time that another social movement, possibly defending the same issue, advocating the same issue, looking for the same resources, emerges back again in society. And when they do, they may use this trace of DNA or RNA in that society that was injected by a previous social movement. For instance, let's think about the Philippines. In 1986, 85 and 86, a lot of demonstrations broke to oust the president at the time, Marcos. And the social movement at the time used a lot of innovative techniques. They had a lot of innovative RNA. One of these innovative ways was to confer to very unconventional but very strong opinion leaders. For instance, the nuns. Another interesting thing that this movement did was to convene in public places that were very, very unconventional. And one of the places was the EDSA highway. It's a central highway in Manila. Marcos couldn't stand these protests and he resigned. Roll the film forward in about 15 years, and in November 2000, another social movement broke out, this time against President Estrada. And when they did, they knew where to organize, they knew where to draw resources from, and they knew where to protest. And like its predecessor, The anti-Estrada movement again organized and used conventional opinion leaders, and they again, as you see in the picture, convened in the EDSA highway in around January, mid-January. President Estrada couldn't stand these protests, and like Marcos, he also had to leave office. Rebirth can also occur through emulation. One of the nice examples that I really like is how the 1970s liberal feminist movement emulated and learned from the civil rights movement that preceded it by a decade, which was led by Martin Luther King. There were a lot of points that they learned and applied to their own causes. The feminists did that. For instance, they really emphasized, like their predecessor civil rights movements, established an intergenerational dialogue among the supporters. So when the women wanted to go out and want to defend their rights, they knew that they had to act as one. So the old talked to the new, old to the young, the educated talked to the uneducated, and they tried to act as one. So they really knew how to establish intergenerational dialogue. Equally importantly, they were acting at a very tough space. The discussion space at the time, including media and other outlets, was dominated by the white men. The civil rights movement has devised very interesting strategies to articulate their opinions and their demands in such an environment dominated by the other party. The feminists used this very well as well. So when the time came, they could resort to very well-established arguments that would resonate among the whole country, that is the United States. And finally, the feminists rode the wave of public attention very well. So when the media finally turned their microphones or turned their notepads to them and really asked, what do you want? Feminists had concrete answers to give. We want X, Y, and Z. And this was another lesson that they learned from the civil rights movement a decade before. Now, if I may momentarily digress here, these 3 points that I just talked about, to certain varying levels of success, have also replicated themselves in the Gezi movement. Intergenerational dialogue. Mothers were an important part of this movement, especially after the first week or so. Humor was a very, very important space for expression, especially under the threat of state persecution. But one thing maybe the Gezi movement wasn't as successful was in articulating concrete demands when the government turned and started listening to them. And sometimes a preceding social movement enables the other movement by giving it hope and showing it that some things are really doable. And an example that I like here is how the Battle of Seattle, the anti-WTO, the World Trade Organization demonstrations in 1999 helped the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement in New York, United States. The outlook was really, really bleak for the Occupy Wall Street in the first couple of weeks of the demonstration. But they observed from the Battle of Seattle that if they just hang in there, if they just stayed coherent for just a amount of time, eventually they could succeed. And which was the case. They hang in there no matter how bleak the outlook was, and eventually the national and the international media picked their story up. Now, this time, let me indulge in being a social scientist. Mankind, an occupational hazard that mankind has is we love to build models, and then we love to scrap them down to pieces, all right? So this is what I'm going to do right now. So I cannot help wonder, am I really forcing the concept of rebirth on what is essentially 2 different breeds of social movements, or 2 different species? How do I really know that one is the continuation of the other? And there are concrete reasons for me to be this skeptical. The first one relates to how social movements and the state relates to each other. Now, if you recall, I told you that one of the reasons that people resort to social movements instead of the state's own channels is that they cannot satisfy themselves with what the state provides them as the terms of expression. But what I observe in a lot of countries, and I dare say in this country too, is that the line between state and social movements is rapidly deteriorating or disappearing. So social movements are no longer necessarily an alternative channel to the state, but rather the state is becoming a tool for social movements, and social movements are becoming a tool for the state. My favorite example here is this guy, Barack Obama. When he was carrying out his 2008 presidential campaign, he ran his campaign as a social movement. So instead of asking money from the big guys, he instead crowdsourced. So he asked for small donations from a very large base. Although his campaign staff were not necessarily very much experienced, they were very much dedicated. So he resorted to a young and dedicated resource base. And of course, being a community organizer himself, so a social movement specialist himself, his message was actually very clear: change. Which is, you really come across this concept in social movements. Now, an interesting thing is if you examine the 2008 elections results, what you realize is Obama was very successful in convincing people who wouldn't otherwise vote to vote. So he didn't spend a lot of time in convincing Republicans to vote Democratic instead. Rather, he mobilized people just to get out of their homes and vote. And for those people whom he mobilized, they mostly voted for Obama. Back to our country, and back to Gezi protest. An interesting point from a social movement's perspective is that when politically threatened by Gezi protests, the prime minister, as a political leader, resorted to his own social movement to counter what was going in Gezi Park movement. So besides using the police and other state apparatus, he also strongly suggested that he could counter this movement by his own social movement. This picture is a midnight meeting of his party supporters upon the Prime Minister's return from his trip to Africa while the Gezi protests were going on. And a second point that makes me wonder whether the new social movements are a new breed, it relates to how encompassing and how penetrating the modern state is becoming. They are very, very, very good now in preventing snowballs from turning into avalanches. And they're using top-notch technology in demobilizing, discrediting social movements, even before they turn into something, even the slight resembling serious social movement. They have unbelievable technology at their disposal. And this reminds me of this antibiotic-bacteria relationship. So the state has so many different ways as an antibiotic to neutralize, right, to kill this bacteria or the virus, which is the social movement. But the next social movement, observing this, becomes more antibiotic resistant, right? So it becomes stronger. And then the state's action becomes stronger. It goes ad infinitum. But at what point does this process of evolution lead to a new kind of species of social movements rather than evolving of what we already know? And honestly, I don't have an answer for that. But this is something that's going on. And finally, many of the social movements are globally linked with each other. No matter how local the topic is, no matter how small of an audience your social movement is speaking to, you can easily drum up support globally like this using the internet, other networking tools. And then it's come so much so that, and since these social movements are becoming overly networked across the world, maybe what we're converging to is one single global movement that's based on the individual, but that's quite anonymous. So at the beginning of this talk, I told you that I wouldn't give you definitive answers. I mean, the more I think about these issues, the more confused I get, seriously. But I think one of the reasons why I'm getting confused about this concept of birth and rebirth and social movements is because I cannot physically empathize with those who can give birth. So in that respect, I think this Gezi protester really conferred to the right authority to ask about the points that he or she was confused about. Thank you very much.